Welcome to Profiles on Nantucket Community Television Channel 18. I'm Charlie Walters. My guest today is Caroline Frey. She is with the Nantucket Data Platform, and she's here to tell us what that is about and what they do. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We'll start with the basics. What is the Nantucket Data Platform?
So the Nantucket Data Platform is essentially a community resource that uses data analytics to answer pressing questions across a range of critical community issues.
And how long has this been in existence?
So the idea came up a little over 2 years ago. Our founder, Alan Warden, is an advisor to Remain Nantucket. And he was at a retreat with them, and they were talking all about what they wanted to do in the upcoming year. And he had a lot of ideas for things that would help the island. But as they spoke, he almost had an epiphany and realized that while he had kind of anecdotes and assumptions, he didn't have the facts and evidence to truly make strategic decisions around what would be the best course of action. And I think that happens a lot on island. People are making critical decisions without having the full range of facts and evidence that they need. And so they came up with this idea of a data platform that could utilize all kinds of different data from all kinds of different sources and help the community, Remain, all kinds of other nonprofits and other entities on island actually answer questions using the data.
So give us an example of what sorts of things you would be looking into and how you would get that information.
So a really good example is our effective population study. We did a presentation at the Dreamland last year, and we wanted to answer a decades-old question on island, essentially how many people live here year-round. So to do that, we aggregated data from multiple sources. The street list that the town clerk manages has about 12,000 residents on it, and everyone on that list is a permanent resident of Nantucket. But we supplemented that with information from a third-party data provider called Civis Analytics. And they collect information on about 250 million Americans. And so they gather addresses from people's credit card statements, vehicle registrations, all kinds of places where you might put an address that may not make it into kind of the official town clerk street list. So using data from Civis Analytics, we're able to identify additional permanent residents that weren't showing up on the street list. And then we did some heavy statistical modeling to calculate the number of children. And so we came up with an estimate for 2017 of 17,160 year-round residents for Nantucket.
Let me stop you there because Nantucket being a summer resort and more of a year-round resort as years go by, it's hard to figure out how many people are here at a given time, which leads to the question, how do you determine who is a resident? In other words, if somebody is here, let's say you're young and you're out of college and you come here in April and you're a landscaper or you're a restaurant worker and you're here until Christmas and then you leave, you're here more than you are any other place. Does that automatically make you a resident?
So everyone usually has one primary residence, and this question comes up with second homeowners as well.
Yes.
They own a house, they own property, but they may only live here, 6 weeks, a month or two out of the year. So we identified people for whom Nantucket was their primary residence. So usually it's the place where you pay taxes or where you're registered to vote. So we used information like that to identify who were the permanent residents and who were the people that were seasonal or just passing through. And the same study actually looked at several different population groups. So we're able to understand permanent residents, seasonal employees, and just visitors.
What other projects does the platform get involved in, aside from population?
So we're working on additional population and demographic work to kind of understand who we are as an island. The demographic work is basic population breakdowns such as age, sex, race, income, household size. That will give us a really good understanding of kind of who we are as a community. And then in addition to that, we're working on psychographics, which get more towards people's values and attitudes and aspirations. So we're completing that work for Remain Nantucket, along with a cost of living profile, which is obviously important to people on island, having cost of living being much more expensive than the mainland. We're exploring a project on coastal resilience. We're exploring behavioral health. We're doing census work for the town as well. We're building a financial dashboard for the town. And one of the biggest and most prominent projects we're working on right now is for the Affordable Housing Trust, to understand the affordable housing and, by extension, just housing on island.
That's a long list of things.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this. When you gather information and you have that information, how does it get from the platform to whomever or whatever organization? Do they pay you to do this? Do they pay for the information you've already received on your own? Or how does that work? What are the economics of this organization?
Right. So the idea is that it's almost an engine in a way, right? So we'll work with an individual client, say Remain or the town or a nonprofit entity, and we'll do a use case or a project for them. And they would pay us for that work. But we're a break-even initiative. We don't make any money. We almost function as a nonprofit, but aren't technically a nonprofit. And they'll pay us for that work. But the beauty of it is that once that work is done, we can use that information and the data and the answers to the questions that we've already developed to build on top of that. So it's almost like if you put more into the engine, it gets more and more powerful and more robust. So the platform grows with each question that we answer. So, for example, the population work that we've done, that's really critical foundational work for a lot of other topics. It's important for affordable housing, it's important for healthcare, it's important for pretty much any other topic, because most of them you really need to know how many people live here. And what's more, you need to understand the population flows throughout the year. So we did a year-round population, but we also did a population for the entire year, down to the day and even down to the minute, because we had ferry and plane data. So we know how many people are on island throughout the year and how that changes with different events and with the season. So all of that gets kind of put into this engine, and then future questions benefit from already having that data at hand.
So what do you think the summer population is?
So we think the summer population is just a shade under 50,000. The busiest day of the year for 2 years running, we've done this for 2017 and 2018 now, and we're working on going all the way back to 2013, so we'll have a longitudinal study of several years. And the busiest day is August 12th, which is when the Pops performed, and it was the same for 2 years in a row, that same Saturday in August.
Interesting.
It's not as high as some people would have expected. I know when I was young, I heard 10,000 year-round and 40,000 in the summer. And then almost every 5 years, people would think, oh, maybe it feels busier. It must be 50,000. It must be 60, 70. So estimates were kind of all over the board. But we have a high confidence estimate that it gets to about 48, 49,000 on the busiest days.
I've heard six-figure estimates. I don't believe them for a minute, but some people do. Some people think that it's 100,000.
Exactly, yeah. And the key question to ask there is, what are those numbers based on?
Yes.
Right?
Well, the 50,000 does not include someone who's just here for the day, if I'm understanding you correctly.
So we look at the daily, the hourly, and the population by minute. Yeah. So a lot of people come during the day and they leave in the evening.
Right.
And so if you look at the flows throughout those people will be captured. And generally during the summer, the highest population peak is on a Friday at 5 p.m. because people have come here during the day. They're kind of leaving on the evening boat if they're a day tripper, and that's also a big turnover day as well. So that's usually the highest is consistently the peak throughout the week is Friday at 5.
So a lot of people are coming here for the weekend or whatever at the same time, but they're not all leaving at the same time.
Exactly.
They might leave early Sunday morning, that might leave Monday morning, Sunday night.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So Friday afternoon seems to be a pretty common time to arrive on the island. And if you look at our visualizations, just nantucketdataplatform.com/visualizations, we have them all up on our website. And we've created these polar charts that it's basically a circle with the months running around the outer rim of the circle. And you can see the yearly population, and then we've done it for the day as well, and you can actually see the flows of people arriving in the morning on the slow boat, and you can see the flows that correspond pretty much with the ferries. And you can see people kind of coming on and off.
I've seen those visualizations at your presentation last year, and they are extremely impressive.
Thank you. We're very, very proud of our data
Yeah, you
team.
should
They've
be.
done great work.
Yeah, it's very well done. It's not just the information, but it's the way it's presented to the layperson that is remarkable and
Thank you.
informative.
And that's key, because if you have a compelling visualization that really tells the story of the data, it's something that people can engage with. Your average person isn't going to sit down and look at a spreadsheet and rows of numbers and really sit there and try to glean insights from the simple numbers. So if you put it together in a way that's engaging and compelling, it leaves a mark.
Let me go back a few minutes to something you were saying before. If I am a business person, for example, I'm making this up as I go along, and I want to open a business on Nantucket, and I come to your organization and say, I want to get this, and that. Some of that information you'll already have, and some you'll have to go out and get for me. Is that correct?
Yep, depending on what you're asking for, yeah.
Yes. And some of the information that you've developed for me, you would retain that, and that would be added to the engine as you spoke, so that somebody else might come along in a year or two with his or her own project, and they would be able to glean their information based on what you already had anyway, and maybe on what I sought out from you.
Yeah,
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay, so that information all belongs to the platform, correct?
Yes, we retain all the data, and we manage all of the data, but pretty much all of our work is public. So we put it up on the website, we share it. We had a big presentation at the Dreamland last summer. We're doing another one on July 2nd, again at the Dreamland. So most of the information you can kind of just pluck from our website, and you can look at the flows, for example. But if you want to do something more, if you want to do some data analysis and ask a new question, then we would work with you and answer that question. But primarily we work mostly with the town, nonprofits. We haven't done any work for individual businesses yet, but we're working on a project for the Chamber of Commerce.
And just to be clear, this is not part of the town of Nantucket. This is not a governmental organization. This is a private organization.
Yep, it's a private organization. The town is obviously one of our customers, and we're working on various projects for them. But we're here for the whole island, so anyone who wants to benefit from the work, we're happy to work with them.
Now, the people who come to you with a project, they're obviously paying to do that. Does that cover all of your expenses, or do you accept private donations?
So it covers most of them. We're break even, so we don't make a profit. So we try to make it work. We've also accepted donations from private individuals who believe in the work, they're excited about the work, and we had what we called a trustee program to kind of get us going, where they donated an amount over 3 years. And that program was great because it really provided the money that we needed just to get up and running, to pay our data scientists. We have to buy data sometimes. So there's a lot of expenses with the project, but we're operating at break even.
Before you tell us what you do at the platform, tell us where you came from, what you did before you came to Nantucket.
I'm a lifelong summer resident of Nantucket. I've been coming here pretty much my whole life, but I'm originally from New Canaan, Connecticut. Graduated from high school there. And then After high school, I went to college in England because my father's Swiss and we had spent some years in Switzerland during my teenage years, and I loved being in Europe. So I went back there and I went to Oxford and got my undergraduate degree in law from Oxford, came back to the States and did my bar exam in New York. So I'm technically a lawyer, licensed to practice in New York. After that, I spent 2 long seasons on the island. The first year I was working for the planning office and zoning board.
I hope you mean long season literally and not figuratively.
Yeah, literally. So from about April, May to September, October.
Okay.
And I loved it. I worked for the planning office and the zoning board, and that was amazing. That kind of gave me a view into how the town worked, which I found really fascinating. And then the next summer, I worked for Remain Nantucket, and I worked on a lot of the projects that we're actually kind of seeing come to fruition now, such as the Orange Street bike path, which is very, very cool to see. And then after that, I did a master's degree in law and economics. That was abroad as well. I was at the University of Hamburg for 1 trimester, then the University of Bologna for a trimester, and then a research institute in Mumbai. And then after that, I came back to the States and I worked at Bridgewater, which is a hedge fund in Westport, Connecticut. I worked there for 3 years. And then I quit and decided I wanted to do something more mission-driven with my life and heard about the data platform from Melissa Philbrick. And she connected me with Alan, and we met last May and have been working for them ever since.
You're obviously multilingual.
I speak English and German, a little bit of French and Spanish.
Now, what do you do with the data platform?
So I'm responsible for what we call customer success. So essentially, I work with any potential customer, anyone who wants to work with us, and I help articulate and define a pressing question. The pressing questions are kind of the drivers of what we do. Each of our studies is designed to answer a pressing question. So for the effective population one, it was very, very simple. It was how many people are on Nantucket. And so I work with the customers to kind of refine that question, then refine the scope of the work, and then once we come to agreement and we start the work, I act as a liaison between the customer and the data team to make sure that we're hitting our milestones and completing all of our deliverables.
How big is the staff?
So it's a combination of full-time and part-time people. We really hit the ground about a year ago is when we really kind of went into this at full tilt. And at that point, I believe we had about 3 or 4 data scientists, and now we have over 40.
Over 40?
Yeah, so it's grown very quickly.
Now, they're not all in Nantucket, are they?
No, none of them are.
None of them? Well, you're here.
I'm here, but I'm not a data scientist.
Okay.
That would be nice. I could not do the work they do. It's really it's a virtual company in the sense that everyone works remotely. For the most part. Our founders, Alan Warden and his wife, Victoria Powers, they're here on island. I'm here on island. But the whole data team and the majority of our folks are off island, and they're around the country and around the world. We've got people in North Carolina, Seattle, California, in London, Argentina, India, Israel, really all across the world, which is it's a little bit of a challenge scheduling meetings with all the time differences. But we want to work with the best people, and we don't really care where they are as long as they can kind of help us do the work.
Well, let me ask you this. Is that kind of a business in Nantucket's future? In other words, do you foresee a time when Nantucket is depending less on tourism or construction or any tourism-related activity and more on the sort of thing you're doing, where the people are not on Nantucket and yet they're contributing to the Nantucket economy?
I think so. I mean, our world is getting increasingly globalized and technology focused. So it really happens everywhere. And I think it's happening on Nantucket to a certain extent because there are more and more jobs that you can do just with a laptop and an internet connection. You don't have to be physically there. But I also think so much of the magic of Nantucket is our physical landscape and location. And so we're always going to have tourism, we're always going to have construction, we're always going to have hospitality. So Nantucket will always have a a large number of workers actually here physically on the island.
We've talked about population studies. Let's talk about some of the other projects you've done. Air routes, for example. There was a great visualization on air routes at your presentation last year. But what have you done with air routes?
So we're working with the airport on a couple of different things. Probably the most interesting one we've done is we were able to show how many people actually came to the island from Philadelphia because we use mobility data. We have a partner called Streetlight Data, and they track people's cell phones. Sounds scarier than it is. It's all anonymized, so we don't know who you are, and we kind of get the anonymized and aggregated data. But using that data, we're able to understand when people come to the island where they're coming from. And we saw that there were huge peaks of people coming from Philadelphia. So we worked with the airport and we gave them that information, and they were actually able to secure a direct flight from Philadelphia that didn't exist before.
That's sort of surprising to me. I knew from Washington there were a lot of people coming in the summertime, but I never knew that. Before you came along, if you wanted to leave Philadelphia to get to Nantucket, you had to go somewhere else first. You couldn't just...
people would fly into maybe New York and connect from there. Mm-hmm. Maybe Washington, or some people may have driven. But yeah, we knew they were coming from Philadelphia, and we could guess they were probably having a tougher time of it because there weren't any direct flights. And that was a real opportunity for the airport to kind of step in, and they got their direct flight, which they were pleased with.
Totally different subject. Tickborne disease. I see on our website you've done some work there. Tell us about that.
So we're exploring some work on ticks. Obviously, it's a hot topic on Nantucket. And the biggest problem is that people, when they get diagnosed with Lyme disease or any other tick-borne illness, you want to understand where they were when the tick basically got on them, and where they were when they caught that. So what we'd like to do is look at the incidences of diagnoses and try to understand what are the hot spots on the island where ticks might live and be active. Because if you have two different fields, right, and in one field there were 10 incidences of Lyme disease from people that were in that field and got bitten. And the other field, there were also 10. If only 10 people went to this field, we know 100% of them are getting Lyme disease. And if 1,000 people went to the other field, obviously it's much lower. So by looking at the proportions and tracking the data and kind of picking up on patterns, it really kind of lights up some of those important trends. And then that could potentially lead to, a phone-based app where you look at the app and you say, I need to walk my dog, but, the weather is looking like this, the temperature is, 82 degrees Fahrenheit, whatever it is, and you see, okay, ram pasture, probably not a good idea, the ticks are really active there, so I'm going to go to Tuppence instead.
Coastal resilience.
Right, coastal resilience. That's a bit of a favorite of mine because it's such an important topic. We've been looking into it more and more recently, and we've come up with a really, really interesting study. Essentially, it's quite complicated, but I'll try to distill it into a smaller piece. But essentially, most flood maps only look at things like kind of blanket sea level rise, and they don't really look at the impact to the actual town or the place. So we've reached out to Bud Reese, who works for the Green Ribbon Commission in Boston, as well as Kirk Bosma, who works for the Woods Hole Group, to understand what's being done in coastal resilience right now. So Kirk Bosma and his team at the Woods Hole Group are actually developing pretty amazing and innovative flood zone maps. And so they started with tracing the entire Boston coastline and looking at if there were to be a storm surge or, a hurricane or any kind of weather event, what would actually happen in Boston. He likes to use the bathtub example. So most flood maps at FEMA and other places are based on a blanket sea level rise. They say if there's a storm surge or a big weather event, it'll rise this many feet. But that's kind of like looking at a bathtub and seeing a level rise in the bathtub up to the sides. But if you put a 3-year-old in the bathtub, they're going to be waving their arms, going to be playing in the water. The water's going to be sloshing everywhere. And that's really more what a storm event looks like. The water just doesn't rise steadily and evenly across the landscape, but it really will affect different areas in different ways. So they mapped that for the Boston coastline. They took it to Mass DOT, and they were so excited about it that now they're mapping the entire Massachusetts coastline. So obviously that includes Nantucket. So when that work is done, we think that will probably be in the next few months or so, we'll be able to use those flood maps to actually quantify and measure the real impact to Nantucket. And it's not only flooding, but it's things like, buildings of historical significance, right? We want to protect our historical heritage. We're such a unique place, and we want to make sure that those buildings are protected. There are vulnerable populations that we have our senior center right now that's in a flood zone. There are a lot of town buildings and town infrastructure that they need to protect in the event of a storm event. So we're going to look at all of those different factors, things like market value of real estate, to understand, is this a $10 million problem? Is this a $10 billion problem? What is the real impact to the island, and what does that mean? And so once we complete that with all of our work, our goal is really to empower evidence-based decision-making. So we're objective. We're not trying to set policy. We're trying to use the data and use the analysis to understand what the facts and the evidence are telling us, and then serve that up to the decision makers and stakeholders so that they can do what they do best.
It's a complicated question for all sorts of obvious reasons, but
Right.
Flooding depends, of course, on wind speed and wind direction,
Right.
which you can only predict so much of. And if you factor in climate change and rising sea levels, you've got your work cut out for you.
Yeah. One of our data scientists, we did a little bit of work looking at weather and how that impacted the population flows. And mostly it's because the boats and planes are canceled and people can't make it to the island. And she's in North Carolina, and she was looking at the data, and she was like, it's really, really interesting. Whenever the wind is coming from the northeast, there's a much, much higher risk of the boats being canceled and people not making it to the island. Mm-hmm. And I was like, well, yeah, that's a nor'easter. That'll happen.
Now, when I'm going away, I always look at the direction of the wind, because let's say it's 25 out of the northeast, the boat might not go. If it's 25 out of the southeast, the boat's probably going to go.
Right.
So
right.
It's
important.
Yeah, these are not simple questions to answer. What else?
So we're working on census work for the town. That was tied really closely with our population work. The key there is essentially the census is coming up 2020, and the town federal census. It's done every 10 years. And the goal there is to get a complete count. Because on average, every Massachusetts resident is worth about $3,400 in state and federal funding. And they allocate that money using the census numbers. So we've done some work for the town, and we identified 800 additional addresses that weren't on the latest census list.
Addresses?
Right. We worked with the town to kind of surface those. And basically what that means is the census has us at about 12,000 people right now, and that was based on the 2010 census, and then they use their models and their methods to estimate how that changes over the next 10 years. It doesn't work well for Nantucket because they usually look at things like population and property spread, and on Nantucket we have nowhere to spread, so we're just getting denser. So the census methods aren't really great at estimating the Nantucket population. So what we did is we found these 800 additional addresses, and we're working with the town to make sure that those addresses are being incorporated into the next census. And even if those addresses show, say, maybe 2,000 extra people live here, that's a pretty conservative estimate, because
That's a lot of people in a small town.
That's a lot of people. Our 2018 estimate of the year-round population is 17,890. But if we capture 2,000 of those at a conservative estimate of about $2,000 each in state and federal funding, it's $4 million And then over the 10 years of the census, it's $40 million. So it's found money that will make a big difference.
It would make a huge difference in a town
Yeah.
this small.
We definitely want a complete count.
Well, now, let me ask you this. 800 addresses that weren't there before. How do you not have, I don't mean data platform, but how do people not know about 800 addresses in a small town? Is this new construction or sloppy record keeping?
No, it's a combination of things. The town does a great job of, identifying people, and they send it to everyone on the street list, and all of the addresses that are kind of obvious addresses that they have records of. They do a great job of that. But these are primarily addresses that they wouldn't have access to. A lot of our work is just being able to access the resources and the tools that just aren't available. And so it was actually, it's more complicated than it sounds, and there was a lot of kind of heavy data work to understand what are actual new addresses, how do they differ. We had to sort through a lot of address matching, things like typos. A lot of times people's listed address isn't their actual address. Some of it is new construction, of course, but some of it is things like, 14A versus 14B. The house is actually a duplex and it's two separate households. So there was a lot of work there to really kind of work through what were real addresses versus what were kind of typos or just mismatched addresses. So, but what we're able to do now is say, these are those additional addresses that weren't captured last time. So let's make sure that we go out and tell the enumerators to knock on these doors, because these are the people that aren't being reached.
One more thing before we go. Cost of living on Nantucket.
Right.
You've collected information on that.
So cost of living is definitely a hot topic. We all know how much more expensive it is to live here than on the mainland. And it's important for a lot of reasons. It helps the town set salaries for people like our school teachers and our police officers. It helps new people moving to the island understand, what it's going to do to their own kind of household budgets, because salaries may be a little bit higher here, but the cost of living is much, much higher as well. So what we're doing is we're building a new cost of living measure. And we've researched national models of cost of living, and by and large have found them to be lacking. So for the most part, they don't incorporate childcare, which is a huge expense for a lot of people. On transportation, they primarily look at the cost of owning a car versus people who use public transportation or a bike or car services. And then on food costs, they use the average cost of food across the state. They don't look at the individual municipality. And so for us, where a gallon of milk at the grocery store is much more than it is on the mainland, that really makes a big difference. So we're looking at all of these methodologies, we're breaking them apart, and we're actually building a new cost of living measure that's actual dollars rather than an index. And we're doing that not only for Nantucket, but for every county in the country.
Every county in the country?
Yeah.
Really?
So we're hoping it will become a new national standard.
This is fascinating stuff. I could talk to you for hours about this, but unfortunately we can't do that. Caroline Frey, thank you for coming by.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
And if people want more information, they go to what website?
www.nantucketdataplatform.com.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
For Profiles, I'm Charlie Walters. This is Channel 18, Nantucket Community Television. Thank you for tuning in. Please tune in again.